Good afternoon, folks. Hope you're well. It's a windy Thursday afternoon here in Hardly Hollywood Studios in beautiful downtown Bowlby. So I thought I'd give it a go here. Give a go at presenting some what I think are some fairly interesting aspects of Paul Hindemith's Fugue Number 1 from the Ludus Tonalis. This is going to be a multi-part analysis. And what I want to talk, and a lot of this is going to be, particularly this particular segment of it, but also in the other segments, I want to focus quite a bit on rhythm. Just interesting rhythm, because lots of times contemporary music analysis, particularly in early 20th century music, we tend to deal quite a bit with pitch, and but also very interesting. They're very interesting are the aspects of rhythm, and I'm reminded at this point of something that Professor Alexander Ringer at one point said in a seminar. He said, "I don't know why you Americans are tied up and concerned with pitch all the time. You know, the American people." He mentioned that how very rhythmic a lot of American music can be, especially in popular music, and he was absolutely right about that. So, with that kind of in mind, but also just things that I've found rather interesting here, I want to talk a little bit about the rhythmic aspects and construction of Hindemith's subject in his first fugue from the Ludus Tonalis. Okay, well, we'll talk through all this fruit salad in a minute. But the first thing I thought I'd do is to present to you just the basic rhythmic shapes, the unadorned rhythmic shapes of the fugue subject. That's the subject, dotted half quarter, dotted half 2/8, and 2 half notes. That's the subject. And the countersubject, but of course the subject is 3 measures long, and the countersubject as written is 4 measures long. Quarter rest, 2/8 notes, dotted quarter 1/8 note in the first 2 measures of it. In the third measure, you have quarter rest, 2/8, and 2 quarters, and then finally in the last measure, you have dotted quarter 1/8 and a half note. So those are sort of the basic rhythmic skeletons of this fugue subject and its counter subject, if you will. All right, now I want to talk a little. Then what I want to do is now let's take a look at the first the 3 measure subject here. You've got this. I have measure A, measure B, and measure C thereof. And you'll notice that A and B are pretty similar to one another. They both start with a dotted half note, and then in A you have a quarter note, and in B on the third beat, and then on the fourth beat of the first measure you've got a quarter note, and then on the last beat of the second of B, that can think of this as sort of being broken into 2/8 notes. Okay. So and C, you have two half notes. All right. Now, if you look at the relationship between these rhythms and the rhythms that are in the counter subject, you'll find that the counter subject rhythms can be derived by various techniques and from the rhythms of the the rhythms of the subject. Now, for example, this A, when it's diminished, this dotted half note followed by a quarter note diminished turns into a dotted quarter note and an eighth note. And so this A diminished, or this diminished form of A, appears in 1, 2, and 3 measures of the countersubject. Similarly, if you take those two eighth notes, that fragment from B, that what I call B frag, or fragment of B, shows up in the first measure, the second measure, and the third measure of the countersubject. So you have diminution, and you have fragmentation of one of them. Well, let's call these three rhythmic motives in the counters on the subject. You have fragmentation and diminution of rhythms that you in the countersubject that you first find in the subject. Now, and you'll notice here, this last half note could almost be thought of as a kind of fragmentation of C, if you want to. But you could also see this as being, as if you take this, if you take this whole thing C and diminish it down rhythmically, you get these two quarter notes in the countersubject. So, which I thought was really I think that's quite interesting, how rhythmically tight, or how rhythmically consistent, or how derived the rhythms from of the countersubject can be generated or thought of as coming from ideas in the subject. And this is something, and this kind of motivic analysis I can remember doing, and still do, in my theory and counterpoint lessons as an undergraduate and graduate school, but also in my own classes at various colleges and universities that I've worked for. So that's really that kind of rhythmic type of construction. It's very tight in a way. And I think that's rather interesting. So that's basic. So I wanted, but before we go on to the further parts of the fugue, and the rest of the fugue, I want to sort of lay out some of the interesting rhythmic, characteristics of the subject and countersubject. But also kind of interesting is that you can think of these things as being sort of derived from the same sort of basic idea of repetition and contrast. You'll notice that A and B of the subject can kind of be thought of sort of A prime. And if you think of that as A prime, like this, that sort of three-part or three-measure structure, I think that structure is elaborated or developed a little bit in the countersubject, in the fact that here you have A prime, not literal repetition, but strong, but repetition through slight variation. First two measures, and then the rest of it. And then in the countersubject, you have the two measures, one right after the other, D and D. Those two repeated, and then and the rest of the thing. So these things, I think, are somewhat similar. I think they can be thought of as sort of being derived from this basic idea of repeat two things and then add something else, and not literal repetition necessarily in all cases, but in variation, which of course is a kind of repetition. So repetition, rest of the counter subject, repetition, rest of the counter subject. So anyway, this kind of thing I think is rather interesting, and is important for us. I think is important for us to have looked at before we pass on to the rest of the fugue. And a good bit of the rest of this is going to concentrate a lot on rhythm, not necessarily pitch, although pitch is certainly very important in this piece. But the rhythmic aspects of this I found to be quite stimulating and quite fascinating and quite interesting, quite worth talking about and thinking about, and I hope you did too. All right, so that's it for Ludus Tonalis Fugue 1, Part 1. I will see you in a few days with at least the next part and possibly another part after that. Have a pleasant day.